It has been 62 years since the Emperor Franz Joseph ascended the Austrian throne in 1848. He was instrumental to the empire's survival in many crises. It survived the Hungarian Revolt, wars of Italian unification, and the Austro-Prussian War, and was now seeing a process of modernization, causing a noticeable rise in social unrest and socialist anti-government propaganda. With the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908, other social issues were added onto the long list of internal problems of the empire. Not only were non-Austrian nationalities demanding for their own national governments within the framework of the empire, with one of such attaining their own government via the Ausgleich, the Hungarians. But now Serbs in Bosnia began demanding the same, also putting pressure on the Hungarian part of Austria-Hungary. Franz Joseph was a deeply conservative monarch, heavily resisting any attempts in internal reform, even to the detriment of the instrument that allowed the empire to hold itself together, the army. The Hungarian nobles who made up the officer corps of the Hungarian segment of the imperial army wanted their own command structure, within which the primary language of the chain of command would be Hungarian. However, the emperor continued to stubbornly resist, forcing the coalition of 48 to surrender on this issue. Seeing how much opposition there was to the severely conservative structure of the army, some changes would have to be made anyways, whether Franz Joseph wanted them or not, such as organizing regiments based on nationality, so Czechs fight shoulder to shoulder with Czechs, Hungarians with Hungarians, and Austrians with Austrians. But on the other hand, that would allow the internal enemies of the empire to stick together and to communicate with fellow conspirators. Therefore, Alfred Redl was entrusted with reforming the secret police of the empire to spy on these internal enemies and foreign spies. In October of 1912, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece and Montenegro have gone to war with the Ottoman Empire. By the end of the Second Balkan War, Serbia emerged much bigger and influential in Balkan politics. Austrian officials became deeply concerned with these sudden changes in the region, as Belgrade was friendly with Austria's arch-enemy, Petersburg. The militarists within Austrian politics, primarily Konrad von Hötzendorf, called for war with Serbia, Italy, Romania and Russia in order to secure the empire's existence in the new century. But the Austrian army hadn't seen a war since the Austro-Prussian War in 1866. Imperial authority was only able to hold back such chauvinists. In January of 1914, Romanian representatives asked the empire to hand over the territory of Bukovina. Unlike the defensible, mountainous, Italian-populated Alps, the Romanian-populated Bukovina did not present any strategic value. In addition, giving up this territory removed Romania as an enemy, with them instead joining up with the Central Powers, also giving the Russians a headache in the event of a European war. One problem that was still unresolved was South Slavic terrorism in Bosnia. Despite Oskar Patriarch's work as governor, the Serbian government-backed organization, the Black Hand, continued its activities in Serb-dominated regions of Bosnia. However, that did not discourage the heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife from paying a royal visit. During the occasion, a terrorist threw a bomb at the car, but missed. Instead, bomb destroyed the car behind it, injuring over a dozen people. While en route to visit the injured in the local hospital, it was then when another lone terrorist killed both the heir to the throne and his wife.
It's a dead end, you fool. I knew this was the wrong way.
I mean, the next left.
Stop arguing. We're sitting ducks here. Get this car moving, now.
despite the arrest of the assassin Gavrilo Princip. During his interrogation, this terrorist revealed that the weapons for the deed were provided to him and co-conspirators by the Serb government. With these facts at hand, Austrian politicians created a list of demands, presenting it to the Serbs. It had 10 demands, but the most important, the 10th, demanded that Serb authorities permit the deployment of Austrian police on Serb territory. Naturally, this breach of sovereignty and national independence could never be accepted by the Serb government, almost as if it was the whole point. Despite concerns of a Russian intervention, the German allies assured the Austrians that the Russians will, for one, take too long to mobilize, and two, will not dare attack Austria because of its alliance with the much stronger Germany. On the 29th of July of 1914, the Serbs have officially rejected the Austrian ultimatum. Austria went to war with Serbia. Russia went to war with Austria, Germany went to war with Russia, and France went to war with Germany. Many said this would be the war to end all wars. Despite all the planning, the Austrian army was unable to cross into Russian Poland or even into Serbia. The man entrusted with internal surveillance, Alfred Redl, fled to Russia, as he was their spy the entire time, revealing the plans to invade Serbia along with it. Soon enough, the Russians captured Lemberg. For the foreseeable future, eastern Galicia was lost. But eventually, the Imperial Army was able to halt the Russian offensive both in Galicia and Moldova. Both sides began entrenching after divisions were redeployed from the Serbian front. Some relief came when in November, the Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of the Central Powers. And then in December, Serbia was overrun when Bulgaria joined too. By April of 1915, both sides on all fronts were in a stalemate. The Western Front in Belgium and France was static. Neither the Central Powers or the Russians could take any ground in Eastern Europe. To try to solve this problem, all armies began developing and weaponizing poison gas. But even then, the two sides began developing gas masks to protect themselves from it. Italy joined the war on the side of the Entente, believing the Austrian army to be too distracted in the Carpathian Mountains to fight back. Having resisted the initial Italian attacks in the mountainous terrain, the Austrian army committed to a counter-offensive with the aim of reaching Venice.
Tu non riesci a vederlo? Sto occupando il lato sinistro.
Sono gravemente ferito!
To support the Austrian offensive, the Germans on the Western Front began a secondary offensive on the French city of Verdun. On February 2nd of 1916, Venice had fallen. This was a catastrophe for the Italian Royal Army, as the road to Rome may as well have become wide open. This caused the King of Italy to resort to extreme measures. He appointed the Supreme Commander of the military, Luigi Cadorna, as Prime Minister, giving all the reins of power in Italy over to the army in order to give them all the resources needed to resist the Austrian onslaught. With the fall of Lucca that same summer, the Italian army was split in two, needing a reorganization of the order of battle. However, the chosen plan of action only resulted in giving the Italians time to hold off the Austrians, allowing for more Entente reinforcements to arrive. Even though it was not obvious now, but in time, this loss of valuable time and momentum to capture Milan would result in Austria-Hungary losing an opportunity to permanently close the Italian front. On July 3rd, Rome had fallen. Soon after, most of Italy was occupied, including Sicily. Despite the successes of the Austrian army in Italy, it still had serious issues which halted its momentum. Primarily, a huge deficit of small arms to supply the garrisons and frontline soldiers. Morale was not doing well either, as Franz Josef passed away on November 2nd of 1916. The new monarch, Karl I, saw clearly that the empire was in a delicate situation, putting it gently. Internally, the chauvinists like Conrad had to be dealt with. The empire was too centralized to win the war. But despite his efforts, Conrad was too valuable as a commander to let go. And even if it was now no longer possible to win the war, the army was at least strong enough not to lose it outright. Conrad even convinced the new emperor that the war will never be won in the west. Therefore it must be won in the east. Thus, on November 16th, a front-wide offensive was ordered against the Russians. But the factors that led to the initial stalemate showed themselves again. The Russians were too entrenched. What nobody could predict, however, was that the army would have a sudden epidemic. shattering the soldiers' morale and motivation to fight. Now that they were also exhausted by Conrad's failed offensive, they were unable to stop the steamroller that fell upon them with all its weight. The Russian winter offensive of 1916 was much more powerful than anybody expected, requiring the redeployment of a whole army from the Italian front to salvage the situation. In January, it was clear to all military commanders in Austria that Conrad has no idea what he's doing, with the Russian offensive reaching into Bulgaria, as well as more than half of all Romania. The situation was only stabilized when Karl took control of the troops himself. Conrad was sent into de facto exile, away from political and military affairs. But one thing was clear. This is one strike that the Austrian army would never recover from. Despite the success of their offensive in April, even being able to fight through German lines and take Königsberg, the Russian Tsar abdicated, with the provisional government being established. Russia took almost 5 million casualties, the most of any of the fighting nations. The situation in Russia only continued to deteriorate, to the point a group of communists under the leadership of one Vladimir Ulyanov, also known as Lenin, the provisional government was overthrown. This presented a great opportunity for the Central Powers. However, they had to hurry up, as with the arrival of American troops, due to the OHL's geopolitical ineptitude, the Entente in the West now had many fresh troops to attack with, resulting in the Western Front being breached, Germany pushed back, and even reaching the River Rhine. Eventually, Austrian troops had entered the undefended city of Moscow. This convinced the Leninist government to agree to peace on any terms. Now the Central Powers could concentrate on their western defenses. The end of Russia was akin to a miracle for the Austrians. Both the common folk and the soldiers were constantly on the brink of starvation. Now, with Ukrainian wheat, there was hope to fight for more favorable conditions with the Entente. However, the OHL did not see it that way. The Rhine was crossed by the Entente. There essentially was no hope of fighting their way back to pre-war borders. And the Austrian army was still unable to break through Entente lines in Italy. The empire itself was slowly falling apart too. On the 27th of September of 1918, the Germans and French signed an armistice in the Compiègne forest. The war was over, the Central Powers lost and surrendered themselves to the mercy of the victors. As per the conditions of the Compiègne Armistice, Austrian forces had to withdraw to pre-war borders. But the Balkans were now forever lost. Hungary too proclaimed independence from the Ausgleich. Despite hopes that the victors would allow for an Austrian Empire to continue existing, the citizens of that empire had other things on their minds. Polish-populated Galicia broke off and joined the new Polish state. The Czechs and Slovaks broke off and formed their own state. Seeing that there was no saving the empire, Karl abdicated. Austria was now a republic. The Paris Peace Conference and the resulting Treaty of Versailles had subjected the former German Empire to a humiliating peace, and Austria to the humiliation of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Both would have their armed forces and military industry heavily restricted. Socialist propaganda reached its peak in January of 1919, when an armed uprising was staged in Vienna. Without the uniting figure of an emperor, the young republic found itself in civil war, just like Germany and Russia.
Fahne soll sich senken, bei deines Namens Klang. Du sollst den Sinn bedenken, wir wollen dein Gedenken, das ganze Leben lang. Du sollst den Sinn bedenken, wir wollen dein Gedenken.
Nicht in Schussweite!
But the socialist rebels were too few and outmaneuvered by government forces. The socialist revolution did not spread beyond the Bolshevized Russia. Many Austrian citizens found themselves polarized, with many joining either socialist organizations or radical right-wing veteran groups. Later, a new ideology will come about: fascism. This new radical ideology would come out of Italy, with the war veteran Benito Mussolini and philosopher Giovanni Gentili being its founders. A new Austrian government will adopt this ideology to combat both socialism and pan-Germanism. However, as history would show, it would not be enough to save Austrian statehood from a radicalizing, National Socialist, revanchist Germany.